Okay, we might as well make a start, I think. For those who don't know me, I'm Ray Edmondson, the president of the Friends of the NFSA, and welcome Graham Shirley, who's going to give us his presentation of The Term is Natural Life. Graham is one of Australia's best-known film historians and many other things besides, but this particular project, which happened back in 1981, is something quite unique. And Graham's going to take us through the whole process and how it happened. So, Graham, over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Ray. My presentation here is very much scripted with illustrations as we go along. So I'll start the procedure now. The epic 1927 film version of For the Term is Natural Life was the most expensive and lavish of all Australian silent films. Costing £70,000, it employed an American director, featured American stars and an Australian support cast. Filmed on a variety of spectacular locations in Tasmania and New South Wales, it received unprecedented publicity. It was hugely popular in Australia, and its producers predicted it would earn its money back through an international release. Today's talk will cover the story of the making of this 1927 Australian film, the film's loss over the decades, and its reconstruction in 1981. Author Marcus Clarke's first literary version of For the Term is Natural Life first appeared in 1870 when it was serialised for the Australian Journal. It was published as a novel in 1874, and new editions were subsequently sold around the world. The book would become the best-known fictionalisation of Australia's convict era. The first of several Australian stage adaptations appeared in 1886. During the first decades of Australian film production, adaptations were produced in 1908 and 1911. Apparently, one of the motivating forces behind what would become the 1927 film version was Marion Marcus Clarke, daughter of the author. Marion's mother had been the Melbourne actress Marion Dunn, and Marion Marcus Clarke forged her own stage career in Australia and America. In February 1926, she returned to Australia to appear on stage for J.C. Williamson Limited. It's likely that at that time, Marion owned the screen rights to the term, as she was certainly her father's literary executor. In mid-1926, pioneer Australian film director Raymond Longford suggested that the Sydney-based film distributor Australasian Films produce a modestly budgeted version of For the Term is Natural Life for the Australian and British markets. Longford had recently directed 3 low-budget films for Australasian. The executives who guided film production at Australasian in the mid-1920s were Stuart Doyle, seen here, William Gibson, and Gordon Balcombe. They accepted Longford's proposal that he direct a version of For the Term is Natural Life, as did Marion Marcus Clarke. Longford began preparing his film, planned to cost at that time £15,000. Dorothy Gordon, seen on the left, an Australian actress with Hollywood experience, wrote a script in collaboration with Longford's son Victor, seen on the right. The film was to star the stage actor and playwright Frank Harvey in the dual role of Rufus Dawes and his villainous double, John Rex. Having read Dorothy Gordon's and Victor Longford's script, Doyle, Gibson and Balcombe decided more money and a bigger market were needed, along with a director experienced in American-style filmmaking. Since an American market was now what Australasian Films wanted, Raymond Longford agreed to step aside to make way for Norman Dorn, an American director who originally arrived in Australia in May 1926 with the intention of making his own films. This is Norman Dorn here. Gordon Balcombe promised Longford that if he agreed to surrender the direction of Term to Dorn, Australasian would employ Longford as a director of subsequent Australian features at Australasian Films. Norman Dorn was not in the top echelon of American filmmakers, but he had started directing short films in the early 1900s and features in the 1910s. Between 1919 and 1921, he directed features at the Universal and Robertson Cole studios, and then became an independent producer, director and cameraman, making films in remote locations, including Alaska and the Pacific Islands. Dawn was also a pioneer of special photographic effects. Key among these was the glass shot, where new ingredients of a shot were painted onto a sheet of glass precisely placed between camera and actual settings. He also pioneered the film use of matte shots, where a part of an image, when first exposed, was blacked out to allow the subsequent addition of such ingredients as a palatial ceiling or spectacular landscape. In addition to his independent filmmaking work, Dawn created special effects for an assortment of American studios and independent filmmakers. In late May and early June 1926, after Dawn had agreed to direct for the term of his natural life, sections of the Australian press criticised the very idea of an American directing term. Sydney's Sunday Truth accused Dawn of being party to the slaughtering of Australia's infant film industry and demanded that Americans should make Australian pictures in Australia and not American pictures in Australia. Leading figures in Tasmania and the Federal Senate called for the film not to be made at all, since they considered the very existence of Australia's convict era should be forgotten. When publicising the making of the film with a multi-page spread in November 1926, the Australian magazine Home headed its article screening our national skeleton, an answer to those who would hide Australia's past from the eye of the camera. Norman Dawn's original budget for term was £40,000. To improve the film's marketing potential, Dawn also imported two experienced, although not top-level name actors from America, along with several supporting actors he had previously worked with. George Fisher, seen here, would play Rufus Dawes and John Rex, while Eva Novak would play the heroine, Sylvia Vickers. Other American actors were Arthur McLaglen, seen here on the right, Catherine Dawn, and Steve Murphy. Australian actors included Jessica Harcourt, Dunstan Webb, Arthur Tauscher, Mayne Linton, and Marion Marcus Clarke, the latter of whom played Dawes' mother. Clarke's novel was set in several locations, including Tasmania, Sydney, Norfolk Island, and London. The story told of the aristocratic Richard Devine, also known as Rufus Dawes, a man wrongly accused of murder who is transported to Australia as a convict. Since he bears a close resemblance to a fellow convict called John Rex, it is Rex who, having escaped convict life, returns to Britain claiming to be Dawes, as he intends to drain away Dawes' family fortune. Dawes meets the villainous military officer Maurice Frere and Sylvia Vickers, a child who grows into womanhood and marries Frere, but not before forming a friendship with Dawes, and then, quite inconveniently, losing her memory. The story's climax is a massive storm at sea and shipwreck. Norman Dawn spent 2 months on research and pre-production. In mid-July 1926, Dawn, along with Australasian Films' William Gibson on the left here and Stuart Doyle, visited Tasmania to choose locations. The American lead actors arrived on the 7th of August, and 3 days later, the film entered production. Initial interiors were filmed at Australasian's Bondi Junction studio, and Everyone's magazine began running a regular series of articles collectively headed Film History in the Making, which detailed every aspect of the shoot. On the 25th of August, the magazine declared, all around Bondi Junction they are rubbing their eyes and wondering whether it is not Hollywood come to life. In the second week, there were over 120 people working on one set, and some of the bigger scenes yet to be taken will call for the employment of another 300 or 400 players. This means there will actually be 500 actually employed for on-screen work alone. This photo shows a section of a crowd of extras queuing to go to work at that studio. After the first Bondi shoot, the company moved to the Tasmanian former penal settlement of Port Arthur and elsewhere on the Tasman Peninsula. Newspapers intensively publicised Tasmanian filming, and numerous spectators had to be regularly cleared from the set to allow filming to proceed. During production, some of the film's publicity articles emphasised that making an epic along Hollywood lines was not only a way of guaranteeing the American market, but was truly a dawn of a new era, pun intended, for Australian filmmaking. I'll now run an extract from Term which shows Rufus Dawes' arrival at Port Arthur and his brief, but to him infuriating, conversation with the Reverend North, who's secretly aware of Dawes' actual innocence. After the first Bondi shoot, the company moved to the Tasmanian former penal settlement of Port Arthur and elsewhere on the Tasman Peninsula. Newspapers intensively publicised Tasmanian filming, and hundreds of spectators had to be regularly cleared from the set to allow filming to proceed. In early September, the company filmed at Tasmania's Macquarie Harbour before returning to Sydney for more interiors. After this, studio work alternated with trips to locations that included the Blue Mountains, Bateman's Bay. Just bear with me here for a sec. It included the Blue Mountains, Bateman's Bay, Pittwater, Berrima, the Wombeyan Caves, and the Sydney suburbs of Abbotsford, Dundas, and Lane Cove. This is actually at Pittwater, this particular scene. 5 kilometres out to sea from the Sydney Heads, an old sailing vessel, the Inca, was used for a ship's fire and explosion, fueled by dynamite and nitrate film soaked in crude oil. Involving 500 extras and coverage by 6 cameras, a convict riot and mass prison escape was filmed on the banks of the Parramatta River near Ryde. A swimming pool at the Nestle factory in Abbotsford was filmed by night as hundreds of gallons of water were loaded into a dump tank, which, when released, pummeled a mock-up of a section of a ship's deck for the storm at sea. And a miniature for wide shots of the shipwreck, seen here, was filmed on a large tank at the Bondi Junction studio. Impressed by what they saw, the board members of Australasian Films allowed the film's budget to surge from £40,000 to £70,000. The next segment I'll run is a 1926 Australasian Gazette newsreel item that shows the shooting of a sequence for the film at the Australasian Film Studio at Bondi Junction. the segment is silent, so I'll talk through this segment. You can see that the cameraman is hand cranking. This is in the era before electric cameras. So practically up until the end of the silent period, cameramen were still hand cranking cameras. Just as projectionists usually continued to hand project. This is certainly within the Bondi Junction studios. You can see there that the cameraman is not only cranking with his right hand, but occasionally he's moving with his left hand, more evident in the beginning of the shot than in the latter part, which indicated that he was also panning and tilting and doing other things to kind of keep the shot in view. You can also see the magnitude of the production. It's very, very unusual, almost unprecedented for Australian production. The actress on set is Jessica Harcourt, whom I met in her later years. You can see a stills photographer there who moves in. Yes, you can see more of that sort of double action of the cameraman there. Probably panning to keep various bits of action in view. Before filming, Marion Marcus Clarke gave Norman Dawn an early edition of her father's novel. When I first had written contact with Dawn in July 1970, he wrote to me that he had used this copy of the novel to prepare a script. But, to quote him, I also carried it around in my raincoat pocket, and often I went over it while I worked. When Dawn posted me the same copy in 1970, I found it was annotated throughout with pencil notes he had made before and during the making of the film. I found lines of dialogue that had been underlined and sections emphasised with marks and margin comments. Entire pages, or even half pages, of what Dawn considered extraneous action were crossed out altogether. The filming of Term finished in mid-December 1926, ending a highly planned 4-month schedule. Editors Catherine Dawn and Mona Donaldson reduced 100,000 feet to a 2-hour release version. Scenes in release prints, following conventions of the silent era, were colour-tinted to emphasise events on screen. For instance, amber was used for some interiors. Just take that back a bit. Amber was used for some interiors, blue for night exteriors, red for fire scenes, and green for bushland scenes. For the Term of This Natural Life premiered at Newcastle's Theatre Royal on the 20th of June 1927. 5 days later, it began its CBD Sydney run at the Crystal Palace, where it ran for 11 weeks, a record for that era. In Tasmania, the film's returns beat those of Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, screened in Australia 2 years before. Within Australia, Term did better business than any other Australian silent film. Australasian Films was confident that Term would quickly find an American market, but it took until June 1929 for the film to have even a small American release when it screened in New York. The film was screened to good response in New Zealand, but failed to be bought for screenings in the UK. In July 1930, Australasian Stuart Doyle announced that both Term and Norman Dawn's second film for Australasian Films, The Adorable Outcast, had incurred a loss of £30,000 after a total investment of £100,000. For Raymond Longford, who had originally proposed that Australasian make the Term, there was a bitter aftermath. In 1927, the year after Australasian failed to re-employ him to direct more films, Longford attacked Australasian Films when giving evidence to a royal commission into Australia's motion picture industry. Besides chronicling 15 years of his own complaints against Australasian, he questioned Norman Dorn's abilities as a producer before saying that Dorn had exploited the least savoury aspects of Marcus Clarke's original novel. Newspaper and magazine critics were kinder about the film, although they did have mixed views. In June 1927, Everyone's magazine judged that there were times where Dorn seemed to shy away from the dramatic possibilities of his story. There were times where he showed a fine perception, but his principal strength lay in mob action stuff. The Sydney Morning Herald said that Turn was a distinct advance on any film yet produced in Australia, with the exception of The Sentimental Bloke. He also praised Dorn for his capturing of inspiring natural scenery and the way in which he skillfully deployed characters in his settings. But the Herald also criticised the film's crudely written scenario and multitude of weak captions. For me, the film never fails to impress through its visual power and mood, especially for the way that it makes powerful use of Australian bush locations. Most notable are the scenes shot in the Blue Mountains, through which Gabbett, the cannibalistic convict, pursues his human prey. Also impressive are the forbidding rock formations along the coast of the Tasman Peninsula and the cave system that John Rex runs through after escaping a line out of guard dogs. Dorn deploys glass shots to re-roof decayed buildings at Port Arthur and matte shots that combine in one image portions of spectacular bush locations, sometimes filmed hundreds of kilometres apart. There's also the well-filmed shipwreck sequence, which intercuts the mock-up deck and cabin interiors with a model of the tiny ship at the mercy of mountainous waves. One of the prison breaks shows the distinct influence of German expressionistic lighting and also prefigures the riot scenes in Metropolis, Fritz Lang's industrial epic film, which wasn't actually released in Australia until 1928. Often in turn, the use of landscape, lighting and framing evokes an atmosphere of gloom and foreboding that was also a potent ingredient in Marcus Clarke's original descriptions of Tasmanian convict life. The next extract from Turn shows some of the forbidding power Dorn and his cameraman Len Roos were able to capture from the often widely separated landscapes they filmed. John Rex's escape from the Tasman Peninsula is followed by the first of the implied killings by the cannibalistic convict Matt Gabbett. What happened to Norman Dorrance for the term of his natural life after 1927? Although the term did receive a small American release, it ran headlong into the industry-wide introduction of sound films. The fact that sound films were all the rage after being introduced to Australia by the American part Talkie the Jazz Singer in 1928 meant that a silent epic like Term had limited re-release opportunities. The film therefore failed to earn its money back. From that time onward, Term's negative and prints were neglected. The film rotted in Sydney vaults and was occasionally chopped into for individual scenes that were used in sound era documentaries or newsreels. By the time I first saw one, it wasn't until the 1950s or early 60s that what survived of Term was sent to the National Film Archive of the National Library for preservation, and by then it was decades too late to save what survived of the decomposing original. But what did survive impressed me greatly. I asked Ray Edmondson, who headed the National Film Archive of the National Library, whether Norman Dorn was still alive. Ray replied that he was indeed, and given my enthusiasm for Term, Ray suggested that I write to Dorn, seen here when making Term. Dorn, by the early 70s, lived in Santa Monica, California, and when I did write, I received an immediate reply. Dorn explained that his son had only weeks before died of a stroke, and Dorn was glad of the chance to exchange letters on matters to do with his films in Australia so long ago. Dorn and I soon developed a pen friendship, with Dorn sending me memories of his time in Australia and reflections on his career. The friendship and my interest in Term included my visiting Santa Monica to interview Dorn in 1972. It was a visit that included Dorn showing me highlights from a substantial project he'd been working on in the 20 years since his retirement. The project involved a series of large sheets of cardboard onto which Dorn pasted memorabilia detailed almost every step, large and small, in his career in special effects. Those effects included individual effects that he had planned to use for the term of his natural life, and a selection of the finished results. What you're seeing on screen at the moment are the sheets dealing with Dorn's special effects imagery for and information about for the term of his natural life. Back in Australia after my American trip of 1972, I began to more intensively research a book that I intended to write about Dorn, and particularly about the 3 films he made in Australia, with Term having been followed by The Adorable Outcast and by the early sound film Showgirl's Luck, the scene of which is seen here. But I then became increasingly busy on other projects, including co-writing an entire book on Australian film history up to 1975. The year 1975 was also the year that Norman Dorn died. But I had accumulated much information on for the term of his natural life and what its original release version contained. In the late 1970s, the American Film Institute responded to the Australian National Film Archive's efforts to internationally track down missing Australian features. The news was that the Institute had discovered the US release version of an incomplete nitrate print of Term. That news became public in Australia in June 1980. Since by that time I had worked in film editing and was well versed in Norman Dorn's Australian films, Ray Edmondson of the National Film Archive, from which at this point I referred to as the NFA, invited me to editorially reconstruct for the term of his natural life. Once I started on the reconstruction in March 1981, I spent a few weeks at the National Library in Canberra viewing all available film and documents that I could use in the reconstruction. This material included NFA stills for scenes that remained missing. Note that I've used the word reconstruction as distinct from restoration. If I or anyone else had been able to restore the film, that would have involved trying to visually restore a complete print or complete negative of Term's original Australian release version. Since that was impossible, reconstruction became the operative word. I gradually worked out a reconstruction script after viewing and taking notes from the Australian and American versions of Term, where I was able to compare the content of scenes which survived in both the Australian and American versions. I quickly discovered that most of those scenes in common were not exactly the same. What I hadn't expected was that scenes used for the American version had been alternative takes, in a number of cases not as good as they were in the Australian original. Discovering this in itself made me realise that although Australasian films' public rhetoric of the late 1920s was that the film was being made for an export market, particularly the markets of the US and Britain, the very best scenes used in the film were used in the Australian version, which strongly implied that the Australian market was being seen as the primary one for the film. Due to the poor quality that usually resulted before the 1930s, when a film laboratory tried to make a dupe negative of any film footage, the practice with many American features shot for a world market was to use 2, sometimes 3 cameras filming side by side as they captured exactly the same action. But for the Term had used mostly only the one camera to film most of its negative. The only exceptions to this practice were on several occasions, several cameramen simultaneously filming to capture additional angles of big action sequences, such as the convict riot and the ship's fire. Not only did the takes used in the American version of Term usually contain moments of performance of lesser quality than its Australian counterpart, but the storyline had been condensed and rearranged for the US version. As was the case with the Australian version, some of the scenes of the US version had become fragmented through wear and decomposition, while others were totally missing. The US version also had different intertitles written in a less formal, punchier way. What I did lack when putting together the film's storyline was an original script, a synopsis, or even censorship records which summarised the film's order of sequence. As my basis for the reconstruction, I used the surviving Australian version, which was generally more faithful to the storyline of Marcus Clarke's novel than the US one. I found the copy of the Term novel given to Norman Dawn by Marcus Clarke to be of great help. Surviving documentation for the film, included an extensive press sheet which contained a music synopsis, and this is the music synopsis down there on the right, which, by quoting intertitles, provided further information on which sequence followed which. NFA had organised for 35mm work prints to be struck from both surviving film versions of Term. Once I had worked out the reconstruction structure on paper, it took me 3 days to use footage from both surviving versions to complete a 35mm assembly of the existing footage in the order of the Australian version storyline, as I understood it. But there were still gaps caused by the loss of such entire sequences as the convict riot, the ship's fire, and reportedly one of the best sequences in the original film, the lead up to and the implied suicide of 2 convict children. The rest of my time between the reconstruction's first assembly and the premiere of the reconstruction itself was a process of editorial fine-tuning and adding newly filmed stills, optical shots, intertitles, and planning for colour tinting and music scoring. Some of the reconstruction's film reels involved me in doing no more than 2 edits, but others had more complex demands. The reconstruction was originally planned to be black and white and utterly silent, and altogether without a music score. But NFA's Ray Edmondson was so impressed by the potential shown by my first, albeit rough, version of the reconstruction, they approached the Australian Film Commission for additional funding. That additional money would allow the restoration to approximate silent era colour tinting and toning and the commissioning and recording of a score. The AFC agreed to fund the reconstruction by investing $68,030 as if they were financing a new film. Film Australia, the federal film unit based at Lentfield, provided cutting room space and 35mm editing equipment, along with negative cutting services, and its sound mixing theatre and staff to record the reconstruction score. One of Film Australia's staff directors, Graham Chase, was assigned to make Epic, a documentary about the making of the original film, as well as my work on the reconstruction. The score for Epic was by a musician called Jimmy Stewart, no relation to the famous actor, who was a friend of John and Robin Godfrey, whose Palm Court Orchestra specialised in recreations of Edwardian music. Crucial to that orchestra's activities was their owning a large vintage music sheet collection called the Benvenuti Orchestra Collection. When I showed John Godfrey the term music synopsis, which had been part of the original press sheet, he recognised many of the music pieces as being stock music whose scores were held by the Benvenuti Orchestra Collection. He was therefore able to use those pieces for the bulk of the reconstruction score. John and conductor Bransby Byrne composed or adapted other pieces of music to match the mood and timing of each sequence. Ultimately, the reconstruction For the Term of His Natural Life consisted of the film surviving but incomplete Australian release version, which served as the reconstruction's basis, the US release version of the film, the images cannibalised from the Australian release version of Term for use in Ghosts of Port Arthur, which was a 1933 documentary directed by Ken G. Hall, several outtakes from Term held by the NFA's Harry Davidson collection, and they included 2 sections of the lashing of a young convict and an image of the Reverend North writing his diary. Further to that, there were stills held by NFA and Film Australia, which showed scenes still missing, and newly written intertitles to bridge the remaining gaps. Again, I was able to consult Dawn's copy of the Term novel, and indeed some of my new intertitles were drawn from passages of the book that had been underlined by Dawn in 1926. I already considered that the original film's climactic storm and shipwreck sequence to be too fast on projection. That is to say, projection by modern projectors, even slowing down to 20 frames or whatever. I therefore asked colour film laboratories to stretch print the sequence, which meant an optically printed repetition of frames, to slow the storm to a natural speed. I also took the liberty of freezing or stretch printing shots which survived only as several frame fragments. Since the early 1980s, such techniques have fallen out of favour in reconstructions and restoration, but in 1981, I was aware of few other precedents that would restrict me. During the silent era, there were 2 alternative ways of colour tinting. On the one hand, tinted prints could be created on film stock whose base was already coloured. On the other hand, sections of a black and white print could be run through different coloured dye baths, and the scenes tinted in different colours edited together before the print was released for screening. Years before the Term reconstruction, a former Australasian Films laboratory technician called Jim Pearson had told me that the tinting of the original Australian release prints of Term had been elaborately impressive. Therefore, with Jim Pearson's memories clear in my mind, I again took creative license in deciding how to colour the reconstruction. Dominic Case, technical manager for Colour Film Laboratories, had already perfected a way for the 1978 film Newsfront to combine archival monochrome newsreels with newly shot colour scenes without the monochrome scenes showing a colour bias when alternated with new colour footage on colour film stock. Since the tinting of film in chemical baths hadn't been possible since the 1920s, Dominic evolved a system by which normal colour positive stock was pre-exposed to simulate the effect of base tints. Using this stock, Colour Film's lab staff employed normal colour grading to add various colour tones to a black and white image. As filmmakers of the silent era had, we used newly created tints and tones to match settings, actions, and emotions. Oh, this is one of the optical scenes from the film, of course. Norman Dawn, being a bit of a whiz kid with special effects, was able to do this, to have the John Rex and Rufus Dawes characters appear in the one shot. There's further examples of the tinting we did on the reconstruction. On the 5th of June 1981, the reconstructed For the Term of His Natural Life, running 97 minutes and backed by the score played live by the Palm Court Orchestra, had its first screening on the opening night of the Sydney Film Festival. Those present at the screening who had been involved in the original film included the actors Jessica Harcourt and Edward Howe, its co-editor Mona Donaldson, and Bill Carty, seen on the right here, one of the film's several cameramen. The reconstruction had already dominated publicity for that year's Sydney Film Festival. At the end of the festival screening of the term reconstruction, the Palm Court Orchestra received a standing ovation. Not surprising, since the orchestra had done much to enhance the interaction between the film and the audience at the State Theatre. After the Sydney premiere, the orchestra recorded the score, which was then incorporated into the 35mm print of the reconstruction screened at that year's Melbourne Film Festival. The Greater Union organisation was a corporate successor to the Australasian films that had produced Term in the 1920s. Soon after the 1981 Sydney and Melbourne screenings, Greater Union's managing director, David Williams, arranged for his company to donate to the National Film Archive the rights that Greater Union still held in Term. Greater Union also distributed the reconstruction for its Australian theatrical release. In contrast to the original version having practically no international exposure in the late 1920s, the reconstruction in the 1980s was screened around the world at festivals and conferences. It was also screened on Australia's ABC television and released on video, and LPs of its score were sold in Australian record stores. And the film served a new purpose, drawing unprecedented public and political attention to the work of Australia's National Film Archive. That attention helped Australians and their politicians to widely accept the federal government's 1984 creation of an autonomous Australian National Film and Sound Archive. Since the 1980s, I've introduced the term reconstruction at various Film Society screenings. Twice in the last 15 years, I and Dominic Case of Colour Film Laboratories, or formerly of Colour Film, have also presented it to appreciative audiences at Australia's Silent Film Festival screenings in Sydney. The Australia's Silent Film Festival is actually a standalone festival, and this is a screening that they ran in the Uniting Church, the very old Uniting Church building in Pitt Street, Sydney. In 2020, Dominic and I were also involved in advising the NFSA on the tinting and toning of a digitised version of the reconstruction. In other words, what had existed prior to that was only the analogue version on celluloid film and video copies and things like that. And hopefully the NFSA will one day release that digitised version on DVD or make it available for screening. And within a decade of Norman Dorn's death, complete copies of Dorn's two other Australian films, The Adorable Outcast and Showgirl's Luck, were discovered in private collections in America and Australia. All that remains to happen is the rediscovery of a complete print of the original Australian release version of Term. Given that in 1927, the film screened widely around Australia and would have had many prints, I'm predicting that chances of at least one original print being found are still reasonably good. And that, folks, is my presentation. And if you like, I'll stop the share so we can open the session up to the Q&A.
Thank you, Graham. That was terrific.
Yes.
Pardon the little bit of repetition at one point. I'm sitting here in close to 40 degrees. I reread a section of the narration, but I think I'm sure people will understand.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it went well. Yeah.
So it was a highly complex operation, and but I think the results have proved very worthwhile because it has been so widely screened around the world, including, I might add, at some point on its circuit in the Castro Theatre in San Francisco, but that was after Dorn's death, unfortunately. Questions?
I can't unmute people. They have to unmute themselves.
Yep.
can ask them to unmute.
I might also add that I have the LP record in my collection. I play it regularly. I just love the music. Because it's what happened, I think, was, and when we look at it in its time, in 1981, while now, you know, there are things like the various silent film festivals around the world. There was nothing like that in 1981. And so to actually see an Australian silent drama with music and tinting and toning in something approximating its original form was a completely unique experience for Australians, and it introduced them to the idea of a silent film that could actually be commercially distributed and enjoyed as a drama, enjoyed for the reason it was made. And so it has had a wide screening, and it was part of the I think the path of raising the profile of the archive, popularising it. That was part of the step towards setting up the NFSA in 1984.
I think what definitely helped was its premiere at the Sydney Film Festival. I mean, the State Theatre. That night there was a very special atmosphere. I think created by the presence of people who'd been involved in the making of the original film, but also the presence of live music. I mean, the chemistry created by the Palm Court Orchestra playing live was very special, and I'll never forget there was one beautiful violin piece where a woman in the Palm Court Orchestra stood up and a spotlight hit her. It was a real piece of showmanship. And she played this beautiful extended passage, and that alone had applause, and there was sustained applause at the end. So that made it a really special occasion.
In fact, if you remember that night, Graham, before the screening, Marcus Street was blocked off, and there were actors dressed as convicts and soldiers, you know, recreating flogging scenes and so on. It was spectacular.
Well, one of those actors was Edward Howell, who played a character called Cranky Brown in the original For the Term of His Natural Life. Now, unfortunately, his scenes are still missing from term. Yeah. But there he was. I mean, he was quite prepared to take his shirt off, and somebody did a sort of imitation, very gentle flogging with a piece of rope. I kept in contact with Edward. I did an interview with him for the then National Film Archive about 6 months afterwards. He was a terrific interviewee. No one had ever interviewed him before, actually, despite the fact that he'd had quite a popular radio career in a series called Fred and Maggie Everybody. Yeah. He and his wife. He had devised that series.
So he was Fred. Was he? He was Fred.
He was Fred. Yeah. He'd been inspired by the Cary Grant, Myrna Loy film, Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream Home or Dream House, and so that was a hugely successful series. I don't think he wrote all the scripts, but the NFSA now holds quite a number of episodes of that series. But it was very popular in its day, and it ran, I believe, for years.
I'd just like to, can you hear me if I speak?
Yes, Linda, yep.
Thank you. Yeah, just to say, I was blown away by the film, which I watched, a couple of nights ago, particularly as an authentic historical record, because it's just amazing. And I hope very much that hang on, I've got a message flashed up. The host has asked me to start my video. What does that mean?
No need to do that.
Don't need to do that.
No.
Ignore it. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Yes, I would hope that, having heard only for the first time, Graham, that the NFSA has digitized the print. It would be absolutely marvelous for that to be made available, for historical and educational purposes too. It's so perhaps we could at the Friends could look into that, perhaps, Ray, too, about giving that a bit of a hurry up.
Yeah, look, I believe that it has been suggested by a couple of current NFSA staff that it has been suggested that the NFSA make something of it. I don't know how advanced those discussions have been, or the point that they've reached, and I haven't heard of any plans that might result from that. So it'd be interesting to find out.
Yep.
Right. Can I just ask your thoughts on why the US version used those sort of second-rate shots, if you like? You'd have thought they would have wanted to get the best possible version out there in the US to make the most of that market, and yet you're suggesting, you're saying that quite a lot of those were sort of, the things that didn't get used in the Australian version. Why was that, do you think?
I've got no idea. It was a big surprise when I realised that, because all the publicity and all the rhetoric in the 1920s was that the film was made primarily, or was made to cash in on an American market. The feeling was that it was making an epic of the kind of, epics had been produced from the dawn of cinema, but they'd reached a new level thanks to directors like Cecil B. DeMille in the 1920s. And I think the feeling was Stuart Doyle and his fellow executives felt that they would be able to cash in on that passion for epics. Yeah, I don't know, unless there was more than one version released in America. There was something about the provenance of this surviving version. It came to light, although the American Film Institute found it and contacted the National Film Archive about it. It was a print that was part of some university's collection, and it had been used for educational purposes. So whether it was, I'm just thinking of this now actually, whether it was in fact the absolute version that was released, I don't know, and it might be impossible these days to find out.
I reckon, like it was back then, I reckon the distributors had come in and said, and they've chopped it up and bloody gone through everything. That's what I would suggest.
Well, that's what happened anyway, that they condensed the narrative and they brought in new intertitles. But that wasn't new for Australian films. The same thing had happened for the same.
One of the curiosities is if it's using alternate takes, that suggests the original negative was not sent out of Australia.
Yes.
This other one was compiled for US, which would be contrary to practice at the time, because if we take the example of the sentimental bloke, the original negative was sent over to America and recut there, for American release. And that was the norm. You set the original negative off because you couldn't make effective duplicating stocks. You had to make the prints from the original negative.
And that happened time and time again.
Yeah. So it seems to be different for term. If there were alternate takes, then one assumes that the original negative didn't leave here, although it has never turned up in Australia. So
yeah. Look, I mean, how many negatives do we have for other Australian feature films? Of the silent era, virtually none.
No.
Yeah.
I think that we did have if it still exists, the original negative for Silks and Saddles. That survives. I don't not sure about. No, I don't have any others. I think all the others survive in print form. But the sentimental bloke negative survived in George Eastman House, and the later reconstruction we did here, it came from a fine grain that was taken off that negative and led back to Australia. So, but it's a bit of a mystery for term, because it's not the conventional practice. Shortening films, yes, they did that routinely, but usually the original negative.
Yeah, look, I think that the chances of finding correspondence or other corporate records that would confirm what happened are very slim these days. Yep. It's just and that you'd need to have access to that kind of material. I mean, some major American studios, their corporate records are virtually all intact, or certainly the major things that you would hope have been kept by such major studios as MGM and Warner's and RKO and so forth. But the only fantastic and generally unknown collection of silent era documentation which is held in Australia is the Franklin Barrett collection, which is really a superb collection, and it's in the NFSA now. It was taken into the NFSA collection in the early early 2000s.
Mm.
But very few people know it's there. But it's a collection waiting for scholars, academics, future writers to go in and mine for a whole variety of reasons. Not only Barrett's work, but also the contacts that he had with other people, like the producer Bland Holt, for instance. A lot of information.
I guess the other thing that killed Term was simply the unfortunate timing. If sound films hadn't arrived, and from 1927 on, you know, the turmoil started, it would have been a very different story, perhaps.
Could have been, yes, could well have been. It was
something I was wondering about was, given that it's the 40th anniversary coming up of the NFSA, whether there might be time for almost putting out a sort of a last film search for, given that you, Graham, and also I think Evan mentioned about there's certain to be other copies hidden somewhere out in the, you know, whether to put out an appeal as part of the 40th anniversary project might be worth for the term of his natural.
That's a good idea. Yep.
Might be worth doing. Yes.
Yep. But also some screenings of Term on the big screen as well, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it just occurred to me that you know, last year was what, the 40th. No, 2 years ago was the 40th anniversary of the term reconstruction. So
that's right.
Frightening.
You feel an old boy?
No, I think we would like to make something next year of the 40th anniversary of the NFSA, and try to build as many things around that as we can. So yeah, so I mean, that's one of several ideas, but I think to draw attention to the work of the archive, to put out an appeal for missing films, anything that sort of takes advantage of the event and raises the profile and raises the need of the archive, and invites you know, public awareness of it. So re-releasing the soundtrack as well.
Congratulations, Graham, on the presentation, and to all on the reconstruction, to all involved on the reconstruction. I found it intriguing, having not read the novel. I was put off it as a schoolgirl by someone who had read it and emphasised the cannibalism. And that put me off forever for reading it. And I'm now inclined to read it more, but I found the use of flashbacks very effective. And I just finished seeing it this morning, and I was interested in the fact that the contrast from what they call the cuddy, which I hadn't encountered before. I hadn't encountered that word before, but I was interested in the contrast in the upper deck and the convicts' quarters, and use of antiquated terms like surrender in the name of the king. That caught my attention too, and
How antiquated now?
Yeah. I have
Here we go.
two questions. There were the initial titles had fur or fire, like fire, on them, and I'm just wondering what caused that, and just remind me of when it was first shown at Melbourne Film Festival. MIF.
Well, the fire is actually nitrate decomposition. That's the image starting to break up.
Yeah, I realised. I thought that.
Yeah, so it was not intentional. It was not an intentional stylistic or symbolic interpolation
Okay.
of the director, although it may well have been.
Yeah.
You know, given the hellish events that follow in the narrative.
Yes, I wondered that. Yeah.
But the screening at MIF, I think, was within a month or two. It was usually the Sydney Film Festival.
They were pretty close together. So the screening at MIF was the closing night.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be, I guess, maybe
1983. Did you say
81?
19?
81.
No, still 1981. Still
Okay.
1981, in the same year.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Graham, thanks for your presentation. It was really very interesting indeed. I actually wrote an extended article about the film, showing how important the film was, because it had been pretty much neglected, for a book called 100 Greatest Films of Australian Cinema. And it was so interesting to discover a number of things. For example, I read a review of the film in Variety magazine in 1927. Now, I wasn't there at the time, but I saw a reprint of that review, and it's so interesting to hypothesize how the film could have been very well released in the US after that review, when in fact, of course, we know about sound cinema taking over, and Al Jolson's film, Jay Singer, and so on. But I was wondering if the marketing of the film in the US was not very well handled to cash in, I suppose, before the sound era really took over. And I was also interested in the nitrate films that were burned on that ship, and that I'd read somewhere that many Australian silent films had been lost because of that explosion burning for the shooting of the film. Can you comment on those things?
Those two things. Well, look, I'll deal with the marketing of the film. The marketing was probably in the hands of a man called Millard Johnson, who'd actually been the distribution partner of William Gibson, who was one of the key executives at Australasian Films. And William Gibson and Millard Johnson had been producers and pioneer exhibitors in the very early 1900s, and among their titles was The Story of the Kelly Gang, or among the titles that they were involved in as early as 1906 was The Story of the Kelly Gang. I don't have any information on how well it was marketed. I'm very much at the mercy of local magazines, but it is a very good question. There's a wonderful website that somebody put me on to not so long ago called Lantern. It's an American driven by, I think, University of Philadelphia or similar institution, which has access to all the key American distribution magazines and fan magazines of the silent period. So it's really a wonderful resource. In fact, it goes up not only the silent period, but also the early sound period. So you've inspired me to go and do a bit of looking there to see if I can find anything. There was, I think, what the problems that Australian films faced overseas before the 1970s was really that we didn't have a very good infrastructure. We had a good infrastructure here for the film trade. Some producers, among them Beaumont Smith and intermittently Raymond Longford and Franklin Barrett when he was producing. They did what they did well, but we were small fish compared to the international film trade, and by trade I mean distribution as well as exhibition. And it may just have been very difficult to make any kind of dent on the American market in between pre-booked major studio films. So that's just supposing. And sorry, what was the other part of your question?
About the burning of the nitrate films, the silent films that have been lost.
Yeah, look, I've heard a couple of versions there. One version, which is the most frequently told, was that yes, there were films that have been taken out of the Australasian Films nitrate vaults, or the film vaults at the back of the Australasian Film Studio in Rushcutters Bay. They had 2 studios in the 1920s, one at Rushcutters Bay and one at Bondi Junction. So there was one story was that, yes, they were, you know, all the early film negatives and prints that survived of early Australian films were taken out of the Rushcutters Bay vault and loaded onto the Inca and then, you know, burnt off the heads. There's another story that does cast a little bit of doubt on that, in that there were 2 very well-known collectors that Ray will remember very well, Roger Mackenzie and Bernie Kent. After Roger Mackenzie died, his housemate Bernie Kent was very forthcoming in an interview that I did with him. It was at a time when Bernie was quite happy to donate their joint 35mm collection to the NFSA, and so that collection went down there, and that was the 35mm collection. He later donated the 16mm collection as well. Now, Bernie, in an interview, told me that he and some mates had rowed out to the Inca in, I think, Berries Bay the night before the filming and the night before the burning, and they'd gone through the entire holdings of film aboard the Inca, and they'd found no feature films. They'd found no feature films at all. They'd found plenty of Australasian gazettes, multiple prints of newsreels and you know, other actualities, but they'd found no Australian feature films. So whether there were others that rode out before them and after them, I've got no idea, shadow of doubt. And there's also, I remember at one point finding in either Everyone's or Film Weekly circa 1930 or 31, a reference to the fact that a lot of film negatives were taken out of the Rushcutters Bay vault at that point and dumped out at sea. What they were, I don't know.
Yeah, this gets into the twilight world of film collectors, which is
Yes.
And so much of certainly the silent material that's in the archive now was originally in the hands of film collectors who picked it up one way or another, and because they did, it survives and wasn't thrown out or whatever. But this was a network. I guess it's probably changed out of sight now, but the people of collectors of 35mm film, and they had 2 problems. It was nitrate. So if you stored nitrate in your house, you put your insurance policy in jeopardy if anybody knew about it. And secondly, what you had was technically stolen material, because the prints belonged to the distribution company, even if they'd been technically written off. And so the collectors were very secret about what they had, and they shared films around among each other, but were rather wary about talking to anybody else. And this was the world that Graham and I had to kind of infiltrate, get to know people, and get stuff, you know, come to the archive. Because the motives they had was, you know, they wanted to save things. They wanted things to survive, so that I can link particular films from the silent era with particular collectors that did save them and hand them over.
Ray, there was another dimension to collectors, and it's wouldn't apply to every collector, but I believe I've heard that it applies to collectors of all kinds of material internationally through history, that they take great pride in holding the only copy, or what is assumed to be the only copy, which makes them feel even more special as collectors.
That's absolutely true. The best known one to do that was Harry Davidson in Melbourne. Harry owned a nitrate print of Metropolis, one of the original 20 prints of Metropolis. So if you want to see it, you had to go to Harry and see it at his house, and that was, you know, that print is now in the NFSA, and it's one of the 4 earliest prints of Metropolis that's listed on the Memory of the World Register for UNESCO. Metropolis is another story. It's a contemporary film, same year as Term, in production. But and in many ways, you know, another tragic story of what got lost, etc. But Harry saved that print, and now after Harry's death, he actually died rather young. After Harry's death, his collection did come to the NFSA. Some of them went off to other archives overseas because it was so much nitrate to look after that some material went to archives in the country of origin. But it was a large collection, and so Harry, among other things, had what remained of Ken Hall's first film, The Exploits of the Emden, which was a German film that First National had acquired in the 1920s, which they felt was unsaleable. And so Ken was hired to shoot some extra scenes and some titles and sort of jazz it up a bit for the Australian market, which he did. And that was his introduction to feature filmmaking. And Harry had the first 2 reels of the Exploits of the Emden. And so it goes, you know, there's so many of the silent films and sound films now, early sound films, have stories like that attached to them. They're very personal stories.
Harry also had a very good collection of FT titles as well, I believe.
Oh, that was Laurie Smith.
Oh, that was Laurie Smith. Okay.
Laurie Smith.
Harry had some FT shorts and features.
Yeah, I think others had FT shorts, but Laurie had the negatives.
Ah, okay. Laurie Smith. That's not a name I've heard before.
Isn't it? Laurie, okay, let me tell you that. Laurie Smith was a clockmaker in Richmond, in Melbourne, and he had a shop that was called the House of Time. And I think sometime about 1970 or 71, I found out who he was and I went to visit him. And he went into his shop and all the clocks chimed on, on the hour. It was an astonishing place. And so I got talking to Laurie. He invited me to come back and have tea, which I did. And he had his 35mm projector in his collection in his back rooms. But there were all the FT negatives in beautiful shiny cans.
Good God.
And he owned the rights.
He owned the rights? How did that
work? He owned the rights. He had the documentation, he owned the rights as well. He got several hands and he ended up with it. And he was worried because he had a bare heart. And he was worried about what was going to happen to them. So in the end, the National Library bought them all for what was really a nominal sum. But he was happy, for that to happen. And it wasn't long after that, he lost the lease on his shop and he had to move his workshop to his home. And he just, he died soon after. Everything ended for him. But but he kept the films and the original negatives, and so the FT negatives are there in the archive. And so the quality of the FT films, therefore, is beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, apropos of collectors, I don't know if you've had contact with these people, Chef and Bob Rothels and Pat Gordon.
Yes.
They've all died now, but have you had contact with people who lived after them?
Yes. Chef,
okay.
Chef was a well-known character.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was Chef who was possibly Chef who put me on to Laurie Smith. I don't know now, but Chef had his contacts as well.
Oh yeah.
I went looking for films and Bob Rothels I also knew. So
and Pat Gordon actually gave me a video of a film I saw in the first film I saw in CinemaScope, I think. Gave me a video copy of that. And I know he actually had his ways and means also.
And the people, Liz, that you've mentioned and that Ray and I have mentioned, they're people that we knew about. But talking to Roger McKenzie, he said, look, there's a whole network of people underground who are 35
yes, I'm sure.
Who he said, we've been sworn to secrecy. He said, Bernie and I will never ever mention their name to you or to most other collectors. There were people that it was just, it was an underground network of people who, as Ray has said, didn't want to be prosecuted, wanted to hold to what they had, and that was it.
Maybe if you could advertise in your advertising campaign, there'll be no an amnesty of sort.
Yes.
Yeah,
that was the approach we took. But even so,
for the greater good.
Yeah, even so, as Graham points out, there were a lot. People didn't want to talk to government employees. I was a government employee.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And so you really had to get to know individuals and gain their confidence. But as Graham said, there were others we never ever got to meet. There was a network, and they did swap things with each other, and so on and so on. During the last film search, I think Mike Cordell uncovered some others that we didn't know about, and so on. But there'd be lots more we never got to, and they were all over Australia.
Times have moved on, and they might be nearer to downsizing. Let's put it that way.
Oh, it's hard for collectors to downsize.
Maybe the time is right.
Yes, exactly.
Graham, thanks for a terrific presentation on the reconstruction. I recall buying a VHS copy of the reconstructed version in the late 80s. I may have misheard you, but I thought you said that the reconstructed version as originally released was 97 minutes. And
yes,
the running print that we've looked at recently is an hour 40 or thereabouts.
Okay.
I'd need to take that as a question on that.
Yes, it's quite a big difference.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe I'm open to revising that.
Yeah.
Maybe I wrote down the wrong duration at some point.
It's only 3 minutes, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter.
It was a 10-reel film, and you extrapolate from that what the original running time was, whereas a normal length feature would be 7 or 8 reels perhaps, and this is running at silent speed, which was a variable concept at the time. And one of the things we noticed in the reconstruction was in getting the scene stretch printed. There wasn't enough money to stretch print the entire film. So some scenes are running a little bit faster than normal. You don't notice it, but the film's running at 24 frames a second. I'd say many of the scenes are actually shot at something like 20 or 22 frames, or maybe even a bit less.
Yeah.
And for the most part, you don't notice that.
Yeah.
And the projection in many theatres would have been still hand cranked.
So, a sequence like the Storm at Sea, if you were a particularly good projectionist, you would slow down your projection speed to accommodate that, whereas with an electric projector or a mechanical projector, you've got something that looks too fast. But there's a lot of term, and there's a lot of the Cheetahs, of course, the McDonough sisters film, which really does look at very close to sound speed. And I believe that by the late 20s, people were being a lot more regular about the 24, 25 frames a second thing.
Yeah. I think over time it had speeded up, from the early days of cinema, it was about 16 frames, but it sort of gradually increased. But it was hand cranked, both the camera and the projectors, and so all that variability was there.
Yeah.
Once it was mechanized, once you had sound, you were stuck with 24 frames a second, regardless.
Yeah. There are wonderful stories. One story I heard in relation to the Cremorne, not the Cremorne, it was the North Sydney Orpheum Theatre, and it was slap bang outside. There was a tram stop. And if the projectionist wanted to make sure that all his customers caught the last tram, and he had a particularly long program, he just cranked more quickly to make sure that he got out the door at the end, which would have made for a fairly farcical kind of experience.
Graham, I'm not feeling in the slightest bit important about this, but there's a small personal footnote to the term. A relative of mine called William Thornton was played aide de camp in term, and the only time I can pick him up in the screening is the scene. The title is The Night Before Deserting Macquarie Harbour, the officers held a banquet, and as far as I can tell, Billy is the right of the banqueting table at the end. He also appeared as a lead in Longford's lost films, The Pioneers and Hills of Hate.
Yeah.
He was a first cousin of my grandfather.
Yes, you sent to Ray, who then sent to me
Oh,
some
good.
information about him.
Yes.
You know, which was very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot in term. I mean, there's a lot still missing from term, and perhaps if we ever do find a complete print, then you'll find a more complete performance of William Thornton and other people.
Yes, it was just interesting being able to spot him.
Yes, at last.
He's
At
certainly
last
there.
in film. Yeah.
So that's a very small DNA connection with the film, but a footnote or a sidebar.
Yeah.
So, anyway, thank you and well done for the whole.
Oh, thank you very much. That's much appreciated.
Cannibalism wasn't a censorship point in its day, but
So, sorry, what was that, Gary?
just in that cannibalism wasn't a censorship point in its day.
I think that was among the sensitivity about the film being seen overseas and representing Australia. I mean, that sensitivity had preceded term. That kind of sensitivity had preceded term with Franklin Barrett having to censor his film, The Breaking of the Drought, to get rid of some of the drought scenes for export, and Ken Hall, when he made On Our Selection, being very heavily criticised that he was featuring, centre screen yokels who would give Australia a bad name in London.
Talking of London, it's interesting. I wonder if it's ever played in the UK. Term that is.
I don't know. What about Ray? Do you have any knowledge of the screening?
The reconstructed version ran at the National Film Theatre in London.
Oh, it did.
Yeah,
Right.
that may have been the only time. The first time it was shown there, I don't know. I don't know that it was released in the UK, but certainly in let's say about 81 or 82, we put together a travelling season of Australian cinema. The first from 1896 to 1956, so the first 60 years, and sent it on a circuit around the Fiat Archive cinemas. So it showed all over Europe and America, and in London it was the National Film Theatre. So that package included Term, The Sentimental Bloke, and the 40,000 Horsemen, a lot of obvious titles, and that was very successful. It circulated for about 2 years, that package.
I'm actually tracking Australian films that have shown at the NFT, but haven't got as far as 81 yet. So I've got the NFT program where it was shown, but so it would be 81, 82, 83, something like that. Okay.
As part of it's called the package was called Australian Cinema 1956, and the whole package was run at the NFT.
Oh, hang on, I might have that.
Okay.
Sorry, carry on while you do.
Okay.
Graham, I was intrigued by the use of the kangaroo in that
yes.
living room sequence. I wonder how many takes it took and whether it attacked anyone.
I think it actually attacked Jessica sitting in the chair there. I think the interview that I did with her, there's something springs to mind. When the kangaroo first saw her, when she was sitting in a chair and went bounding up and gave the chair a huge kick, and she went flying backwards. But she was young and fit and recovered quite quickly. But I think that was the only occasion I'd heard of in relation to that particular creature.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're at 3:30, so I suppose we should wind it down soon. Are there any further questions or comments?
I don't know whether you saw my note, Gwenda, but I thanked you for organising this.
Well, actually, thank you very much, Liz, but I don't deserve that because actually I didn't organise this.
Oh, okay.
It may have some of the resending of invitations may have had my name on them, but this was all organised by the Canberra, our national committee, our national committee. So I don't think it
thank you to everyone involved, and thanks to Gwenda for what you do. Yeah.
Thank you, Liz.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments for Graham?
Where would you start looking, Ray and Graham, for all these collectors that are underground? Because somebody must know who they are.
Oh, well, the numbers of people who know who and where they are probably diminishing.
Yeah.
And we're looking at old-fashioned analog collectors, very different to, some of the massive DVD or VHS collection, of course. You're often looking at people who live on remote properties, who have a lot of storage area. I heard of a collector who was quite well known, actually. This is one of these sort of terrible tyranny of distance stories. He was on a remote property in Queensland, and somebody bought his equipment collection because he had quite a substantial collection of cinema machinery, of all kinds, of all eras, and they were mostly interested in that. And but they also bought his nitrate film collection, but they were not interested in the collection. But they were also, I believe, this is second or third hand information, they were not interested in anyone else having the film collection, so they had it buried.
Oh.
Brought in a front hand loader. Nobody knows. It is apparently a substantial nitrate collection, but nobody, we can feel slightly relaxed. Had we known that there was a complete print of term there, I think I would have been, my blood pressure would have ratcheted up permanently for a long period of time. But I had no information whatsoever what was in that collection, apart from the fact that it was nitrate.
Do you have any idea where it is now?
No, the person who told me was still cards close to the chest, so he was not about to tell me who or where. But he was texting me because he was really angsting about it, and I said, look, the fact that we don't know what's in it is a bit of a sanity saver in itself. But yeah, and look, the international fraternity of film collectors, if you can call them that, are getting older. The number of people who want to collect this kind of thing are getting older. The films themselves are getting older. And if they're sitting in a hot iron shed, in central New South Wales, for instance, they're less likely to survive than if they were in a shed in England or New Zealand or Tasmania.
Well, hopefully they wouldn't be that silly because they're collectors and they're going to look after their shit. But yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, they might not have the technology to look after it long term.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and they'd be less likely to come forth themselves, being secretive people, and so which is why it's why we ran the last film search in the 80s and went out looking, and even that had to be incomplete because it could only go on for so long, so it could only touch what can be touched in the available time, and there's more out there and more that we'll probably never find.
Yeah. When did nitrate really get knocked on the head altogether? How long was it?
1951.
Right, so it's still swapping over between both for like 10 years before that, or 20 years?
Well, it was phased out in 1951, replaced by safety film for the industry.
Yeah.
So the nitrate, some of it gravitated to film archives, some of it was in the hands of collectors who liked it partly because it was nitrate.
Yeah.
And what's the outside life of nitrate? Nobody knows. So we do know it decomposes. We also know if it's kept in good conditions, it stays quite viable.
Yeah.
So as Graham said, if it's sitting in a galvanised iron shed out in the middle of New South Wales, the chances aren't too good that it's going to survive.
Yeah.
If it's in a cool place, in a different climate, the chances are better.
Yeah.
But that's it. And it is analog, and so it is less and less concurrent with the way people collect things now. You know, it's a different type of material, and fewer people are able to show it.
That's an argument for starting your search in Tassie.
That's right.
That's the thought, yeah.
Yes. Well, we did find things in Tassie, and I might add, by the way, that one person who showed interest in Graham's webinar was Jackie Lambie.
Oh, okay.
Senator Jackie Lambie, and she told me she wasn't able to. She's travelling today. She couldn't link into the webinar, but she wanted to see the film, so I sent her a link, and I'll send her a link for this webinar when it's on the website.
Great.
So you know, so I think it has a resonance for Tasmanians.
Oh yes,
Absolutely.
certainly.
I mean, those shots of Macquarie Harbour are astonishing. You know, they're very, very good.
Yeah.
On this note, I have a friend who would be interested to see it. May I send him the link?
The link.
Tasmania.
Yeah, the link expires today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm watching myself yet. I don't have time. I better do it.
Okay.
However,
At midnight? At midnight?
I don't know. I was just told it would or maybe it expires tomorrow. I don't know. You can check when we're finished and see if it's still there.
Liz, the one other thing is that the NFSA has viewing centres where they don't have actual NFSA offices. So quite often they've got viewing centres in state libraries, for instance. So Tasmania may have that kind of.
Yeah, but this is a person who is confined to home.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, he's.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm pretty sure it expires tomorrow,
Yes, I think that's correct.
the 20th.
Yes. Okay.
At some point, I hope that it can just be put online permanently and people can see it, but that's not the way.
Yes.
Not the way they're playing it at the moment.
Right.
Okay, so I guess at this point, thank you, Graham. That was a terrific presentation. And, I mean, there's always new things you learn about term.
Yes. Well, I'm still finding additional images, still images. Yesterday, I thought, I wonder if there's anything on. I found one image that had come from somewhere in Tasmania, and I thought, let's do a search on Trove under image search. The term is Natural Life, 1927. Page after page after page of photos of on location in Tasmania came up. I go, oh no. How much time have I got? So I harvested maybe 3 or 4 and put them up, include. Yeah.
So anyway, thank you all for joining in. I think it's been a very good discussion. This will go on the website in due course, and you can come back and look at it again. And I do hope that your term can be more normally available. I mean, as Ren said, it was available on VHS for a while. It's not available in any form at the moment. It ought to be available on DVD, but it isn't. But it should be. It's a film that should be readily available to people. Yeah.
Yes. Here.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
So thank you all.
I should apologise in advance too. I suspect that there's some gaps in the audio of the recording today. Small gaps. I don't know what was causing it. Somewhere in the internet, it just stopped the audio. It wasn't getting to my computer, so it's probably not getting to the recording. But it was only short bits.
Okay.
The video kept going.
It wasn't much. It wasn't much, Chris. It wasn't much.
No, that's good. Okay.
People are fairly tolerant of just short little glitches like that.
Yes.
It's when you've got a frozen frame for 5 minutes.
I'm afraid it's the nature of the net, as we all know.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm afraid so.
So thank you all, and well, thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Graham.
Well, thank you all for your interest.
Goodbye.
Thank
Much
you
appreciated.
very much.
Okay.
Thanks,
Righto.
everyone.
Okay.
Bye.